Thank you for joining me for this video segment on how to correctly write the materials and methods section of a scientific lab report. You can start and stop this video as much as you'd like until you finish the video. You will need a writing utensil and paper for this video segment to take notes and quiz yourself. At various points, I will ask you to pause the video to write down your notes or thoughts. These moments are an attempt to make this video a little more interactive. Let's begin, and good luck. The objectives of this video are to guide you, the scientific researcher, on how to correctly write the materials and methods section of a scientific lab report. First, I will describe the function of the materials and methods. Then, I will emphasize the do's and don'ts of writing this section. Finally, I will point out the fine details that demonstrate a well-written materials and methods section. Please note that the do's and don'ts will be addressed throughout the video, then summarized at the end. If you are ready, let's begin. First, let's talk about the function of the materials and methods section. With any scientific research, whether the research is published in a peer-reviewed journal, presented as a thesis or dissertation defense, or written for an undergraduate or graduate course, the author includes a materials and methods section. This section may be quite extensive or very brief. The materials and methods section answers two primary questions. First, with what was the data collected? And second, how was the data collected, reported, and analyzed? Scientific studies also need this section in order to gauge whether or not the design of the experiment is good and whether or not the study is repeatable. Let's take a moment to distinguish between the materials versus methods in this paragraph. We will first start with the materials. Take a moment to read this paragraph and make a list of the materials required to complete this study. Please pause the video to give you time to complete this activity. Then, start the video when you are ready to proceed. Did you write down the following items? Terracotta planters, the potting soil, plants, bee traps, 2-liter bottles, glucose solution, and the plots in Taylor's fork? There are some materials that are assumed but not mentioned in this section. For example, paper and pencil to record data, a clock to remember when to collect the traps, glassware or weighing instruments to mix and measure the concentration of the glucose solution, vehicle to transport the planters, or computer to analyze the data. These items, while necessary, do not have to be specific to perform the experiment. That is, it does not matter which type of pencil you use to record data, simply that the data is recorded. For your first attempt at writing the materials portion of this section, you will be tempted to do the following. Create a list. A list of materials is the first don't for writing this section. You do want to provide the materials in this section of your report, but you want to provide them in paragraph form. You don't want to list every possible material that you think the reader needs to complete the study. Remember, some items are assumed. Now, let's talk about the how. How was the data collected, reported, and analyzed? There are three major sections in this paragraph that describe the collection method, how the results were reported, and how the results were analyzed. Take a moment to read the paragraph, then draw 2 lines, with your finger of course, that separate the 3 main sections. Again, pause the video, then start it when you are ready. Did you draw the 2 lines here? In this example, most of this paragraph is dedicated to the how were the data collected. The sentence is above the first line. And very little of the paragraph is dedicated to how the data were reported and analyzed. The chi-square is specific to analyzing counted data. For example, the number of bees that fell in each trap or flower. We will not discuss how to complete a chi-square analysis, but please see the next video that addresses this process. For your first attempt at writing the methods portion of this section, you will be tempted to do the following. Write the methods in cookbook form. Let's compare the two. Take a moment to read both paragraphs. What is the primary difference? Please pause the video to think and write about the primary difference, then start the video when you are ready. Did you notice that the correctly written paragraph was written in the passive voice and in past tense, while the cookbook style was written in imperatives and written in present tense? If so, good. If not, that's okay. Now you know. Let me reiterate. What you should do when writing the methods section is explain in relative detail the methods to determine whether the science is good and repeatable. I say relative detail because you do not have to record every step in your experiment. For example, you do not have to tell the reader that you used a pencil to record the number of bees. You should also write in the past tense and in passive voice. We will talk a little more about passive versus active voice in a minute. What you should not do is give the reader orders. Write in present tense and write in active voice. Remember, the methods are written in past tense because the study has already been completed. Now you are simply telling the reader what you did in the past. Another example of the don'ts when representing the materials and methods can be seen here. The paragraph on the right demonstrates the methods written in a step-by-step process. Using this method, you can see all three forms of the don'ts. 1. Giving orders. 2. Writing in present tense. And 3. Writing in active voice. Let's take a few moments to focus on writing in passive voice. As I mentioned earlier, when writing the materials and methods section, the sentence structure should be in a passive voice. Let's take a moment to understand what passive voice actually means. First, we need to understand the backbone or the basic structure of a sentence. This may be reviewed for most of you, but just in case, we will provide a refresher on sentence structure. Basic sentences are constructed using a subject, a verb, and the object. For example, in this sentence, the researcher collected bees. You can easily see that the subject of the sentence is the researcher. The verb is the word collected, and the bees are the object. Piece of cake. But let's rearrange this sentence. Now, this sentence is written in passive voice, where the subject is at the end of the sentence, and the object is at the beginning. The verb is essentially in the same place, with an extra word, were. The word were is technically an auxiliary verb. Other auxiliary verbs that you may come across or use in passive voice are was, have, had, has. Be sure to check your English books on when to use them correctly because you will frequently use them in scientific writing. Let's practice. On your screen, the first sentence is written in active voice. Take a few moments to rewrite this sentence in passive voice. Stop the video and then restart when you're ready. Did you write something like this? If you did, good. If not, that's okay. Notice that the object of the sentence has moved to the subject position of the sentence. The verb is in roughly the same spot, but this verb is modified by the auxiliary verb were. The subject is assumed, therefore you can remove the I from the sentence. Technically, the sentence should be written like this. However, in scientific writing, you do want to be short, sweet, and to the point. The words by me are unnecessary. By this point in our video segment, we have covered the general how-tos, do's, and don'ts of writing the materials and methods section. Before we move on to the fine details of writing an excellent lab report, let's recap or summarize the do's and don'ts. We'll start with the don'ts and end on a positive note, the do's. First, you don't want to create a detailed list of every single item that you use in your experiment. As you write your sentences, you don't want to give the readers orders or write in imperative sentences. You also don't want to write in the present tense or in active voice. You do want to provide enough description of your materials so that the readers can use the same or similar items, but write about them in complete sentences. You also want to write in past tense and in passive voice. The last objective of this video segment is to point out the fine print, or the details that demonstrate a well-written materials and methods section. Let's take a look at the fine print, or the details that indicate you've written an excellent materials and methods section. First, in this paragraph, the author has referenced a table and figure. Sometimes, a table or figure summarizes the materials and methods clearer than the descriptive sentences. First, let's focus on the sentence that references the table. Then, we look at the sentences that reference the figure. This sentence tells the reader that the plants were divided into 4 equal groups with 1-month-old plants. But this sentence does not tell the reader how many plants and what kinds of plants were added to each planter. Rather than writing about each group and plants individually, the author references a table. And ta-da! Here's the table. Let's interpret this table. First, we know that there are 4 groups of planters. And now we know the 2 types of plants that were added to each planter. We also know how many plants of each kind were added to per group. For example, planters in Group 1 received 0 plants. Planters in Group 2 received 6 purple coneflowers and 0 Jerusalem artichokes. Planters in Group 3 received 0 purple coneflowers and 6 Jerusalem artichokes. The last group received equal number of plants. Finally, each table should have a title that explains what the readers are seeing in the table. The title should be descriptive enough that anyone who saw this table independently of the rest of your lab report would understand what is represented in the table. We could have written the information in the tables in sentences. However, which do you think summarizes the information better? Translation. Which looks less cluttered or less wordy? The top or bottom segments? I hope that you can see that the bottom segment is less wordy and less cluttered than the top section. Now let's take a look at the sentence that references the figure. Sometimes figures are needed to give the reader a clearer picture of the author's method to study design, etc. Figures and tables can be used to summarize the researcher's results. Regardless of their use, the figure is referenced at the end of the sentence. Similar to a table, the figure should have a title that explains what the reader is seeing in the figure. The title should be descriptive enough that anyone who saw this table independently of the rest of your lab report would understand what is represented in the table. Whether you're creating a table or figure, they must stand alone. If your stack of tables and figures were dropped in the hallway, then anyone should be able to pick up either and be able to answer the questions: who, what, when, where, and how. Please watch the video segment, Data Representation, on how to effectively create a table and figure. We know that the author needs to reference any table or figure, but next we need to emphasize how. Notice that the table and figure are referenced at the end of the sentence, enclosed by parentheses, followed by a period. However, you don't typically reference tables at the beginning of the sentence as a standalone sentence, after the period at the end of the sentence, or without the parentheses. Now, there are always exceptions to these rules, but first and foremost, follow the format according to the journal style or your instructor's instructions. For the next series of fine print examples, I will take a different approach using this poorly written paragraph. We will first focus on the number format and then the appropriate use of the units. Take a moment to write down all references to a number in this paragraph. Please pause this video to give you some time and start it again when you're ready. You should have written down all the underlined numbers. Please note that the date and year are technically numbers. We will not focus on these because they are written correctly and not the focus of this video. If the numbers are underlined, what do you generally notice about them? More specifically, are they consistent? You should see that the numbers are inconsistently written. Some are spelled out and some are written as numerical values. Rule number 2 states to write the word, not the actual number, for numbers less than 10. For example, the numeral 4 should be written as the word 4. However, you'll see that I only underlined one numeral. There's a second part to Rule 2 that instructs to write the actual number and not the word when the number is used as an adjective. Now, let's talk about the units. You'll notice that the units are in liters, months, tablespoons, cups, and square inches. Some are written in English units, and some of the units are written in metric units. Rule number 3 states to use only the metric system to report your units. Typical metric units for volume include microliters, milliliters, or liters, while typical metric units for distance or area are millimeters, centimeters, meters, or kilometers. Area, of course, requires a superscript to indicate squared. We'll talk about superscripts in a moment. You can report time as seconds, minutes, days, months, or years. In the paragraph, which 3 units are incorrectly reported? You should have selected tablespoons, cups, and square inches. Now, Which metric unit would you use instead of a tablespoon or cup? You should have suggested microliters, milliliters, or liters. Which metric unit would you use instead of square inches? You should have suggested square centimeters, meters, or kilometers. Rule number 4 states to use a hyphen or dash in between the numeral and unit when together they represent an adjective. For example, the size of the terracotta planters is described as forward liter plants. In this case, forward liters requires the hyphen. Each of the underlined numbered unit combinations are used as adjectives. Rule number 5 states do not use a hyphen when you're indicating the actual volume used or distance measured. The underlined numbered unit combinations in this case are used as measurements. Please read the underlined sentence and jot down what is wrong with this sentence. Pause the video to give you time and start the video when you're ready. Now, think about this. What if the reader wants to make a glucose solution using 550 milliliters of water? Would the reader still add 7 milliliters of glucose? Here I want to emphasize concentrations. This sentence is very similar to the cookbook method. First, add 7 milliliters of glucose to the 63 milliliters of water. What is the total volume that is created? 70 milliliters, right? What percent of the total volume does 7 represent? 10%, right? The correct way to report on how much glucose solution that you made would be to report the concentration. For example, each trap was filled with a 10% glucose solution. Now the reader can make a 10% glucose solution using 550 milliliters of water. How much glucose should the reader add to make a total volume of 550? There is one more thing that is missing. My first question is, how much of this glucose solution was added to each B trap? Our final corrected sentence is each trap was filled with 60 milliliters of a 10% glucose solution. The second to last fine print item that demonstrates a well-written lab report is the use of subscripts and superscripts. Superscripts are letters, numbers, or words that fall just above the normal text. For example, square meters is actually meters with the superscript 2. Although not specifically used in this example, subscripts are also letters, numbers, or words, but they fall just below the normal text. For example, N subscript X. The subscript and superscript are usually found in the Home tab of your Word document. And yes, take the time to add these special touches to units that require either. Finally, the author may include scientific and common names throughout their publications or reports. Remember our table. Notice that the scientific names are italicized and the genus name is always capitalized, while the specific epithet is always lowercase. Also, when using the species name in a sentence, the genus name is shortened to its capital letter followed by a period upon the second, third, fourth, etc. mentioned in the name. The specific epithet is still lowercase. Okay, we have completed the fine print rules and regulations. Here are the before and after paragraphs. Take a moment to compare the two paragraphs. Do you see where we fixed all the mistakes? You should also notice that the paragraph actually got shorter. Upon the successful completion of this video segment, you should be able to describe the function of the materials and methods section of a lab report, correct the instances where you followed a don't versus a do, and finally, modify the fine details to demonstrate that you know how to write a good lab report or any other scientific paper. Finally, you do want to be consistent throughout your writing, and when in doubt, follow closely the journal's or instructor's guidelines. For your final activity, test yourself on what you learned during this video segment. Use this paragraph to find what the author did correctly and then write down what you would suggest to the author to fix. Please pause the video to give yourself some time to critically evaluate the paragraph, and then start the video to compare your corrections to the final version of this paragraph. Here is the correct and final version of this paragraph. What did you overlook and what did you get right? That's all, folks. Thanks for your attention and happy writing.